Someone you love has just left you, or maybe they've done something terrible to you, and you feel like your heart has been broken down into 1,000 pieces. The colors of your life just seeped away, and everything is in grayscale, and you find it hard to get by every day. You can't sleep, you can't do anything, you're practically bothered. You're in so much pain, so much suffering. The heartbreak has got to be one of the most painful experiences of life, and we've all experienced it at some point, and maybe some of us going through it now. And what is so interesting about it is how universal it is. It doesn't matter who we are, or where we're from, and indeed which time period that we live in. Everyone has experienced the heartbreak, or will experience the heartbreak at some point in their lives. And given how painful it is, truly one of the great miseries of life, it really made me wonder whether philosophy could actually provide a key for us to understand what's actually going on, to solve the heartbreaks in our lives. And you might think this is a very detached proposition, but if you were to look as far back to ancient Rome, the Roman philosopher Boethius actually wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, where he suggested that many of the miseries of life can be solved when we turn our minds to higher places, essentially philosophy. And I think one of the great starting points perhaps would have to be the French philosopher of the 20th century, Simone De Beauvoir, who many regard as the first feminist and existentialist, a prolific author who, when it came to the matters of the heart, had a very unconventional sort of dating life for a woman in the 20th century. She actually had a lot of affairs and a lot of casual relationships, oftentimes simultaneously with many people. If anything, if you looked at her dating life and how she approached relationships, it is clear that it wasn't the most important thing to her, and that she had a very sort of laissez-faire approach to dating. Now, De Beauvoir would ask us, why is it we experience misery in our dating and relationships? And if you really ask yourself why you've put yourself into this position, according to De Beauvoir, it would be very clear. It is because you've actually made your relationship the most important thing in your life, essentially the purpose of your life. You've derived all the meaning from it. So when it ended, or when something has happened, of course your entire world has collapsed, because that relationship, that person was your entire world. Now this might sound very romantic, but De Beauvoir would ask us whether this is actually a good thing. Whether it is a good thing to make the relationship the meaning of your life. Surely there must be greater things that we should be pursuing to derive meaning from, rather than the relationship alone. And as basic as it sounds to many people, a lot of people, when they get so invested in someone, it gets to an unhealthy point that that person becomes the entire world for us. And that is not necessarily a healthy thing. De Beauvoir would suggest that we are on this earth and going through life in the pursuit of greater meanings than deriving our only purpose from dating and other people. And just like what De Beauvoir had actually done in her life, which is really creating these great philosophical works and really becoming this amazing philosopher and author, perhaps we should also be designing our lives around better priorities rather than a single person. From another context, we could also look at the work of Greek philosopher Epicurus, a philosopher I've covered in many of my videos. But for him, when we're in pain, it would be against his entire philosophy, because to him, life is very much about the pursuit of pleasure through the minimization of pain. But the reason why we would be in pain, at least according to the Epicurean view, is largely tied to the sort of desires that we actually pursue. Now, Epicurus believed that in life we might have many desires, but many of these desires would be very hard to fulfill, what he called empty desires. When it came to the matters of the heart, he would say, for example, pursuing romanticism, the idea of these romantic moments in your life. If you were to mold your entire sense of pleasure and happiness from that, you would never be fulfilled, because it is essentially something you could never truly fulfill and satisfy. And in terms of the heartbreak, oftentimes when we feel that pain, Epicurus would ask us to think about how that pain has originated from the desires that we might have for that relationship. Perhaps it's an idea that you've always wanted this great love story that you've seen in some movie or some work of literature, and you want to have the exact same thing, and you've not had it, and you're feeling this great sense of pain. And Epicurus would say something like that would be something that would never be satisfied. And rather than chase these desires, we need to have better desires. And this really makes us think, because oftentimes we might feel sad over a certain heartbreak, but we've never really wondered, what is it that we're sad about? What is it that we felt like we've lost? And whether those things that we've been chasing, that we wish could be realized, are even worth it, and whether they are truly things that we can satiate. Interestingly, even if you were to move east to Eastern thought, and for example, the work of the Buddha, we see the same things too. What the Buddha would suggest is that we feel deep suffering largely because of the desires that we have in life. We have all these desires in the same sense that Epicurus has mentioned. But the Buddha would go on to highlight that it is because we have these desires, and so many desires, and the fact that the nature of the world and the universe is really one of impermanence. Everything is eventually ends at some point, and that we want to try and exert control and change the laws of the universe and make everything permanent. When you mix these two things together, we feel a great sense of suffering when things do actually end, or we're unable to fulfill our desires. And indeed, when it comes to relationship, in the vein of the Buddha, a lot of us might have unrealistic expectations that the person that we fell in love with, that person that we're into, that this amazing moment of passion, of happiness will always be the case, and that things would never change. But this is of course against the impermanent nature and the transient nature of life. Yet we delude ourselves and become incredibly sad. Everything must end sooner or later, and everything changes. Everything is always in a state of change and flux, even people and relationships, of course. The Buddha would of course advise us to learn to overcome our inner demons and actually develop a more enlightened view of the world, seeing the world for what it really is, rather than what we think it is. And so far we can see many of these philosophers that I've mentioned, they've actually focused at the root cause of why we're heartbroken, why we feel sad, and a lot of it has to do with our desires that we have. But beyond that, in a greater sense, we've also got to understand what life is, essentially. And this is where we could start with the work of Zeno of Citium, who many regard to be the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy. Now, in a very Stoic way, Zeno would ask us to realize that peace can only be attained by living in harmony with the true nature of life. And for him, that is actually realizing that life is full of sunshines and rains, that there are going to be a lot of happy moments in your life, and there are also going to be a lot of sad moments in your life. But the key is not to get overly happy or overly sad, not to be attached specifically to the changing paces of life. That the key to harmony is to realize that as much as you might be happy at any point in your relationship or at some past point, things can also happen. And as long as we realize that life is full of ups and downs, that's the starting point of us realizing how to truly attain peace. Because the problem occurs when you try to control the pace of life, when you want it to always be sunshines. And that's just practically impossible. Yet that is the source of much of our pain, when we want to always live in the summertime. We can't control what we can't control, and we'll only be upset and frustrated. In the same sense, when things truly do happen, when your relationship ends or something terrible has happened that has broken your heart, realize that's just part of life, and there's nothing you could do about it. And Zeno's sentiments would also be shared by German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who I've also talked about in some of my older videos. But the idea that he presents is very pessimistic in a way. It is just the fact that life is filled with misery. There is so much misery. Bad things are bound to happen to you at some point or another, and they probably will keep happening to you as long as you're alive. And as pessimistic and as gloomy as that seems, Arthur Schopenhauer would say, don't do anything about it. Don't try to mend it. It is just a part of life itself. And rather than try and fight it off and try and challenge it, or think about ways you could create a time machine and change all of that, accept it. As much as you might cry and roll around in pain and listen to all this sad music, get used to it. It's just part of the human condition. And I find this line of thought to be very interesting because, of course, I think a lot of us are deep romantics at heart. We tend to have a very idealized view of life. This sense of childlike naivety that everything will be always amazing and perfect. But the truth is, things will happen and that we will be saddened, especially when it comes to matters of the heart. Rather than see it as this thing that we're trying very hard to avoid and prevent and resist, we just got to embrace it because it's a condition of us being alive today. So I thought maybe I'll end with one of my most favorite philosophers who I think presents a view that ties everything up together perfectly, and that's got to be Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. Now, he would have truly great things to say about suffering, because if you looked at his life, truly is the epitome of suffering. His father died horribly. He went through a crisis of faith. He was rejected by his lover, and in the end he had syphilis and he died. So his life is very much suffering. Yet in all this suffering, he came to realize a lot of existentialist truths about how we should really live and exist. And so his view about the heartbreak would be rather interesting. Where most philosophers, and perhaps most people, especially of a religious background, they would idealistically say that there's a purpose that things happen, that you are suffering perhaps because of some grand design from the universe, and there's great meaning in why you're going through this breakup. Nietzsche would reject all that, and he would say that we should accept that misery is a part of life in the same sense that Schopenhauer had mentioned, because Nietzsche also believed that suffering is an inevitable part of life. Yet rather than just suffering, Nietzsche would say that suffering is actually an opportunity rather than a setback, because he believed that suffering can actually be life-affirming. It is the fact that we suffer, especially in context and matters of the heart, that when we finally fall in love again or experience greater relationships again, we will appreciate it so much more because we've actually been through that. And much more than that, if we can take this sort of attitude and actually search for meaning ourselves from the sufferings that we actually experience, we can actually come to greater realizations about ourselves and actually become much stronger as people and discover greater purpose through our suffering. In other words, the suffering can actually shape us. And because of that, Nietzsche would say that if you've had your heart broken, you're lucky, because that's a chance for you to entirely transform. And truly, some of the greatest tragedies in life give birth to some of the greatest metamorphoses. So Nietzsche would ask us to embrace our heartbreaks. For only when our hearts are broken can we truly develop stronger hearts, and hearts that will truly take us to greater heights.